Good evening. My name is A.K. Goodman, Anna Catherine Goodman. Everyone calls me A.K. I am a gynecologic oncologist at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and I'm really excited to greet you all for our annual ethics forum. This was actually our fifth year of an annual ethics forum, our first year virtually, and our theme this year is at the crossroads of ethics, law, medicine, and anthropology. How do we respond to the need at our southern border? This conference is being sponsored by Strength and Serenity and the MGH Disaster Response and Humanitarian Action Group. Just a word about us. Strength and Serenity Global Initiative Against Gender-Based Violence is a group at Mass General that seeks to create a worldwide consortium of best practices, develop training programs, publish on issues related to sexual exploitation and abuse with the goal to end gender-based violence. MGH Disaster Response and Humanitarian Action is the group at Mass General Hospital that works on disaster response. I am a member of both organizations, the head of Strength and Serenity. Our disaster response group was recently deployed to Matamoros, Mexico, and bore witness there. In our session tonight, we are going to have four panelists give us their thoughts about these very important issues in our very complicated world. I am excited to introduce Dr. Nancy Berlinger, who will be our moderator and will take us through this whole session. So just a word about Dr. Berlinger. She is a Hastings Center's research scholar whose work focuses on two major themes: ethics and societal change arising from population aging and the role of health practitioners, systems, and policymakers in the care and the well-being of migrants. These themes reflect her long-standing interests in decision-making and care concerning serious illness and near the end of life safety and harm in health systems, the moral dilemmas of these cares. Dr. Berlinger is a graduate of Smith College and received her doctorate in English literature from the University of Glasgow and Masters of Divinity with a focus on ethics from Union Theological Seminary. Currently, she is working with the support of the World Health Organization to co-develop a framework and toolkit for analyzing gray literature generated in community-based COVID-19 response as sources of promising practices and policy ideas to support migrant health justice. I want to turn it over to Dr. Berlinger now, and I'm very excited that you all are here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, AK and colleagues. It's a great honor to be here with you tonight with such extraordinary panelists, people I revere, whose work I read, to have a chance to talk about this issue in depth at MGH, whose work in so many areas of immigrant health has been so extraordinary. I'm especially honored to be here because tonight's event is dedicated to the memory and to continue the legacy of our colleague and friend, Dr. Leah Zalman. Leah, as many of you know, was tragically killed in an accident on Election Day 2020. She was just returning from voting. She was 40 years old and she left her husband and two children. Leah was a primary care physician at Cambridge Health Alliance and director of research at the Institute for Community Health, which has established a center on immigrant health as her legacy. She was a nationally renowned empirical researcher on immigrant health and the cost of care, including the cost of not financing adequate care for immigrants. We'll talk more about her legacy, but her studies are absolutely bedrock to policy change in this country. They have literally moved the needle on policy in the United States. She tirelessly made herself available to a national and international research community. I don't know that we all knew each other personally, but I was very proud to be a colleague of Leia's. Whenever I would come to Boston, I would meet with her at Porter Square Books. I think they would open the cafe for her because it was so early in the morning. And she was always cheerful, always ready to talk about research and collaboration and ways to improve healthcare on behalf of immigrants. And then she'd be off to her rounds. She would just go on to the next thing she had to do. We'll talk more about her legacy later, as I mentioned, and maybe those of you who knew her or knew of her would like to contribute remembrances in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm sure that would be greatly appreciated. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jackie Baba is a human rights lawyer. She's professor of the practice of health and human rights at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She also has appointments at Harvard Law School and Harvard Kennedy School. She's director of research at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard. Heidi Castañeda is professor of anthropology at the University of South Florida. Her research interests include medical anthropology, borders, migration, migrant health, and citizenship, with a special focus on the US-Mexico border. And I think one thing that's really helpful given our theme tonight is to try to imagine the border not just as a physical place, but as a sort of state of mind, as a framework for a place where we put a lot of our questions and concerns about migration. Obviously, in other parts of the world, people don't think in terms of the US-Mexico border, but often there's a charged place where we think about these issues. So that tends to be our charged place in the United States. So Heidi is going to tell us about this. As is our next speaker, Marcia Griffith, who is a professor of pediatrics and director of the Division of Child and Family Health at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley School of Medicine. She's an expert on the trauma experienced by migrant children. She is a national leader in policy work on behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics on this issue, so that pediatricians have a collective voice around this aspect of child health. Wes Boyd is a faculty member in psychiatry and medical ethics at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston and is on faculty at the Harvard Medical School's Center for Bioethics. During his career in Boston, he also worked with Dr. Zalman and knew her well. So, and he is very much a colleague of mine in the field of bioethics and bioethics teaching. So welcome everyone. Now, next, I'm going to turn this directly over to Jacqueline. You're going to hear from people in the order in which I've introduced them. And each speaker is going to present for 15 minutes. And then in each case, I can always come back on and remind anyone who's the next person. So nobody has to be worried if they're not sure who comes next. So now I will turn the floor over to Jacqueline Baba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bellinger, and thank you to AK and to Mass General for this invitation. I didn't have the honor of knowing Leia Zalman, but what you say about her does sound admirable, and people like her are so essential for humanizing what is often an inhuman system of exclusion and stigma that we all experience. So as Dr. Bellinger just said, I'm a human rights lawyer, and I thought that in the short time I have to make some introductory comments, I would just highlight 4 key issues where law intersects with ethics and with the rights of migrants, to set the scene as I see it. So the first point is really that international law, which applies globally, including to the United States, makes it absolutely clear that everyone has a right to claim asylum from persecution. That means that anyone who is facing what technically is known as a well-founded fear of persecution is legally entitled to present themselves at a border to apply for protection. What that means in practice is that someone presenting themselves at the US-Mexico border, whether they are Guatemalan or Sudanese or Salvadorian or Afghan, is legally entitled to make a claim for asylum. There's nothing illegal about it. So I think this is actually quite an important clarification, because so often our politicians tell us that the people flooding in at the border are illegally trying to sneak in to take advantage of, access to resources that they don't have, and access to resources that they're not entitled to. That is false. If people claim to have a well-founded fear of persecution, for example, because they are facing a threat to their life, or for example, because they face extreme violence, or for example, because they are being threatened by a gang, they are entitled to claim protection. That is international refugee law, which has been in place since World War II. So I think this first point really clarifies a lot of what's wrong with our current system, which is that we demonize people who are actually trying to exercise a right that for over half a century has been recognized as being a really key building block of a civilized world, post-World War II world. The second point I want to make is related to that, and that is that because of the way in which our countries are organized today, because of the way in which borders have been constructed, because of the way in which many countries try to exclude people from entering, people who have a claim to asylum, people who are refugees, often have to use professionals to get access to a border. In other words, it's not straightforward for somebody to just come to a border on their own and say, look, I have a gang who's trying to kill me. I need to claim asylum. They often need to find somebody who will help them get to a border, because states make it very difficult for people to get to these borders. And we all are familiar, I think, with pictures of boats in the Mediterranean, or people crossing the desert between the US and Mexico who are risking their lives in order to simply make this claim for protection. So my second point is that the fact that you as an asylum seeker have used somebody who is you're paying to help you get to a border, who may be called a smuggler, does not mean that you are illegitimate. The fact that you are paying a smuggler to help you to do something which you need to do to protect your life does not make you illegal. And I think that's something that many people don't actually understand. Excuse me, I have to just turn on my phone. I apologize. So in fact, sadly, today, the majority of refugees need to use smugglers, professionals, in order to access safety, because states have made it so difficult for people to just normally get to a place of safety. If you are wealthy, if you can buy a plane ticket, if you can pay somebody to get you a visa, if you look respectable at the border, then you're probably okay. But if you don't have the funding to pay somebody to get you a visa, if you don't have the means to buy a plane ticket to get a route to get you to a safe border, then chances are you're going to have to pay a smuggler who's going to take you through some devious route where you're less likely to be excluded or sent back in order to make your asylum claim. So I think these 2 points really show how pernicious much of our current system of border control is. Firstly, that we are really often told by newspapers, by the news, by politicians, that people arriving at the southern border between the US and Mexico are illegals. And often, our previous administration actually called them worse than illegals, called them rapists and undesirables of all sorts. And secondly, we're often told that people who pay in order to get access to a place of safety are somehow doing something which is unlawful and which is illegitimate. And both those claims are false. And maybe in the Q&A we can discuss that further. But I think what I'm saying maybe is so different from what we often hear that you might find that surprising. The third point I want to make is a more health-related point. And I know I'm in the presence of doctors and of, this is an event hosted by Mass General. So many of you maybe have a medical background. We have, for the past years, since the COVID pandemic hit all of us, had in place laws which link border control to public health concerns. And in principle, there's nothing wrong with that. Public health concerns are a good reason for excluding people if that is warranted. What is not allowed as a matter of international law and international justice is to use public health as a pretext for excluding people who do not pose a public health risk. So in the context of the US-Mexico border, we've had in place, since the advent of the COVID pandemic, exclusion policies which demonize or categorize people trying to cross the US-Mexico border to claim asylum, categorize them as public health risks without any evidence that they have a higher incidence of infection, without any evidence that they pose a risk to border control, without any evidence that they are seeking to avail themselves of facilities which they're not entitled to. This is an illegitimate use of public health exclusion, because in international law, if you're trying to use public health, a pandemic, some sort of, public health crisis, and COVID would be such a crisis. If you're trying to use that to exclude a population, you have to show that the measures that you're using to exclude people fulfill two requirements. You have to show that they are proportionate to the risk, and you have to show that your measures are reasonable. What does that mean? That means that, say you have somebody, as we've had tens of thousands of people who are fleeing life-threatening violence and who are being excluded at the southern border. If they claim that their life is in danger, then the onus is on the American government, for example, in the case of the US-Mexico border, to show that it is proportionate to exclude them. That's a very high bar. That's very hard for a legitimate official to say, your risk, the risk you're posing to the border officials or to the US population outweighs the risk to your life. And so, as international lawyers, we have argued that these exclusions are not proportionate. Secondly, to show that you're acting in accordance with international law, you have to show that the decision you're making is reasonable. It's based on evidence. But people are not being tested. People are not being given the opportunity to prove that they are not COVID positive. It's not reasonable to have a blanket ban that excludes everybody. So the point I'm trying to make here, and I guess this is my third point, is that if you're going to use public health as a reason to exclude people, which you can as a government, you have to show that your policy is proportionate and that the decisions you're making are based on reasonable criteria. And I think many of us in the human rights community have argued that neither of those two criteria have been fulfilled. And unfortunately, the policies instituted by the previous administration are still in place with this administration. And so this is one of the great frustrations, and perhaps other panelists will talk about it. It's one of the great frustrations that we are still experiencing, that thousands of people are wrongly being excluded from protection simply because of an abuse of a public health exclusion option. The last point I want to make is a broader point that goes to the whole question of ethics, which is what we're addressing today. The reason that people often talk about a crisis at the border or a migration crisis is, I would suggest, that governments willfully fail to prepare for what is predictable. Migration, large-scale migration, is not unexpected. It's not actually a crisis. It's a new normal. And we're going to constantly see large numbers of people crossing borders, as we have for decades. And sometimes those numbers go up and sometimes they go down. It's a function of conflict, it's a function of climate change, it's a function of economic factors. There are many factors which affect this. But the fact that large numbers of people are moving is not something unexpected. Our governments willfully refuse to prepare, willfully refuse to allocate resources which are commensurate with the need. And so, of course, you create a crisis. And I think it's a good exercise to think, imagine if we did that for people who were trying to claim tax relief for something or other. Imagine if we did that for people who are trying to get a license to open a hotel. Imagine if you under allocated resources in that way. You'd have a crisis. You'd have people up in arms. You'd have a crisis of inability to open hotels. You'd have a crisis of inability to process tax returns because you fail to allocate the right amount of resources. Well, that's what our governments are willfully doing at the border. We know that we have huge backlogs in asylum claims, huge backlogs at the border, not because there's a particular migration crisis, but because governments are willfully refusing to do what they know they ought to do, which is to just allocate more resources, have more border patrol people, have more immigration officials, have more asylum decision makers, have more judges, so that the system moves more smoothly. And I think there's a broader point related to that, which is that very often the host communities, the frontline communities where asylum seekers or migrants arrive, the domestic frontline host communities, often start off being generous, welcoming, open-armed. You know, they exercise a kind of ethical humanity that all of us would like to think we would do as well towards people who are in need. But then when governments fail to support these communities, willfully, I would argue, when schools are overcrowded and health facilities are overrun, and when, you know, garbage collects on the streets, and when migrants don't have access to resources and so they commit petty crimes in order to survive and so on, then of course those frontline host communities turn. And that initial solidarity, that initial feeling of empathy turns to hostility. And often we say, well, there's xenophobia. Yes, but that xenophobia is a product of a failure to prepare. So I would say, and this is my fourth and my last point, that these borders are charged places, as Dr. Berlinger says, they're charged places because we make them charged places. We don't anticipate predictable need. And I think as ethical people engaged in these issues, we need to really make a claim of our governments to act on the basis of knowledge that they have and information they have about the needs that arise. Because at the end of the day, these are potentially win-win situations. These are typically young, energetic, dynamic people coming in search of work. People who have skills, who have ambition, who have resources, which are going to be beneficial. And the worst thing to do is to demonize them and put them in a position where they become desperate and where they antagonize the host communities who typically start off being welcoming and generous. So I would say that to conclude, we need to get our governments to respect their international law obligations, which mean that asylum seekers have a right to seek asylum. Secondly, we need to recognize that just because somebody has used a smuggler doesn't mean that they are a criminal or that they have a criminal intent, but rather that they're trying to evade controls which make it impossible to seek safety. Thirdly, that we should not use public health exclusion criteria to wrongly and unfairly exclude people who pose no particular health risk. And fourthly, that we should ask our governments to use the data they have and the predictive capacities they have to adequately cater to the needs that we know are going to arise in border situations. So maybe I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. We're going to hear now from Heidi Castañeda. So you can start whenever you're ready.
Yes, hi everyone. First of all, I want to apologize for the horrible lighting. I'm actually currently in North Africa doing research on transit migration, and I'm doing so from a comparative perspective. This is another one of these charged borders that we've been talking about. I typically work on the U.S.-Mexico border, but I'm using some of the insights gained from the U.S.-Mexico border to think through some of the similar situations that are happening in North Africa on the border to the EU, to Europe. I wanted to talk today, I want to return to the US-Mexico border. Again, so just wanted to apologize a bit for my connectivity issues here, and talk about three issues really. I want to just briefly touch on some of my work that has been in Mexico and on the US-Mexico border, following migrants both in transit settings through Mexico and in border communities themselves, specifically in South Texas. And I know some of our other speakers are going to talk more about this. And then I'm going to spend most of my time, actually, I want to just kind of lay out a couple of principles related to how we can think more critically about migration in clinical settings, about migration and health in general, and sort of go through a few principles I think are important as we move forward having discussions around these issues about how we can sort of unsettle some of these entrenched ideas that the previous speaker just mentioned, issues that are often willfully produced by governments. So in regards to the first 2 points, one piece that I really wanted to add to the conversation, and I'd be happy to elaborate in our Q&A a bit more, is that as migrants pass through communities on the US southern border in particular, when they pass through Mexico, they're encountering a lot of Mexican citizens along the way as well, and are engaging in different forms of solidarity and care along that route. So the route may be dangerous, and I do know that, obviously we're going to be talking a bit about some of the specific dangers, especially to unaccompanied minors. But I do want to also emphasize the fact that we want to, that we can't only talk about tropes of sort of victimhood, but also recognize that there are communities being created in transit settings along the way, along the journey, and also in border communities when people arrive. Most of my work has been in South Texas on the US-Mexico border. And one thing that was really striking to me is the willingness of people in border communities to sort of pitch in and help and express various forms of solidarity with people who are coming. In border communities, most people themselves have a migrant background. Often they've lived in the United States for a very long time. In South Texas, where I've worked, the average time that the folks that I spoke with, that I describe in a recent book, they lived in the United States for 19 years. But many of them are still undocumented. Many of them have family members who are undocumented. And this shapes their orientation to life in the United States. And so as more and more people come over from Central America who are not from Mexico, they're also engaging in these acts of solidarity and care as they encounter people and try to find ways to help them. So I'd like to talk more about that in the Q&A if we have time. But from an anthropological, ethnographic perspectives, those were 2 points I wanted to add to the conversation, is that you do see both along the journey and in the reception communities, especially in the US-Mexico border, you do see various forms of solidarity being enacted that I think is an important aspect of our discussion on ethics today. So I want to spend the remaining time to just sort of lay out a few more general principles that I hope will kind of lead us in the conversation to the next speakers who are going to talk about specific interactions, including from a medical perspective. So I want to make sure that, to kind of like set the groundwork for that a bit as well, as sort of as a transition from the previous speaker to the next speakers as well, to kind of put out a few ideas in sort of rethinking, destabilizing, troubling our entrenched notions about migration and health. So I'm going to call these some principles to sort of consider when crafting a critical approach to migration and health. And I've got 15 points, but they're all interrelated, and I just kind of want to run through them and sort of set the ground, as I said. So the first thing I want to point out is that it's important from a critical perspective to look for causes of ill health and injury and disease, not necessarily in behavioral or cultural factors, but rather in the structural conditions of inequality that are produced. And specifically when it comes to the US-Mexico border and the Central American migrants and refugees who are arriving, to look at the larger historical and political processes that underlie those conditions of inequality. And specifically, here I'm thinking about decades of US intervention in the region from both a military perspective and from an economic perspective, and destabilizing this region and creating some of the conditions, the preconditions for people to move for various reasons. So I think that's one of the key things I want to sort of add to the conversation too, is just that when we're talking about migration and health in clinical settings, and I know other speakers will get to this as well, that these structural conditions that they're coming from are so critical. The second point is that we need to be really explicitly attentive as critical scholars, as critical practitioners, as people with an interest in ethics and medical ethics, to be explicitly attentive to social, political, and economic power and the way that it's exercised and distributed. And I think it was brought up quite nicely in the previous presentation, this idea of willful redirection or misdirection of resources is one really great example of how to do that concretely, to think about these issues. Number three, to really acknowledge that migration itself and any sort of health related consequences are the result of broader globalization and colonialism processes that displace populations, really linked to the first point that I was talking about, these underlying structural conditions of inequality, and how these are linked to sort of ongoing globalization and colonialist practices, in particular in Central America, in this region. Another, I think, important perspective to take, another critical piece to add here, is to be very cautious to really to reject binary oppositions, ideas of sending countries and host countries, or migrants and citizens. I think these are really, in many ways very outdated, very, very entrenched, and have consequences for the way we deal with these populations. Specifically, they don't, we need alternative vocabularies that can acknowledge sort of the complex, tangled, temporary and intermediate experiences that people have, those the situations and spaces that they inhabit that aren't binary. They're not always here or there. Similarly, related to this, migration is not a linear, unidirectional process. It's not easily split into discrete phases. So you don't have, people leaving their home countries, transiting through, for example, Mexico, and then arriving at the US-Mexico border. It's not that linear. Oftentimes people are moving back and forth. Oftentimes they're moving through Mexico and then they're returned. They come to the United States, they're returned to Central America. There's a lot of movement in many directions happening, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. I think thinking about this as a practice of mobility rather than a linear migration with discrete phases is a really critical way to sort of disrupt what we think of as stable partitions between here and there. So I think, considering the fact that it's not always here and there, there's a lot in between that are intermediate, temporary, tangled types of experiences that people have. And I know we're going to talk in a bit about the asylum process a bit more specifically, and that's a really good example too of where you see just a lot of complexity in ways that you wouldn't necessarily predict. Another, I think, really critical piece I wanted to bring into the conversation is that it's very important that we tread lightly, that we're very cautious in the way that we talk about, study, and practice with and for migrants from the unproblematized standpoint of being citizens of a country of reception. So, in other words, the researchers, the clinicians' positionality the practitioner's positionality is really important because it plays into intrinsic inequalities that are happening in clinical settings or in research settings. So really thinking through the fact that, that we are not a blank slate, we are not neutral. When we discuss migration, we're speaking from a position of a particular privilege and intrinsic inequality because of the colonial processes that have kind of played into migration in the region. Really importantly, I want to, this is like my point 8, I really want to think about the border as something that is not a natural or fixed object. I really would like to bring into the conversation a troubling of this idea of borders and actually of migration in some ways as not as fundamental. I think that the previous speaker also mentioned this, that human freedom of movement, and specifically in the case that was just mentioned, the claim to asylum is a fundamental right. And freedom of movement should not be portrayed as transgressive, as exceptional, or as pathological. It's part of who we are as humans to move, to be mobile, to migrate. That doesn't mean, however, that migration is a natural phenomenon, right? It is unnatural in the sense that it's produced by social, political, and economic processes. But I think recognizing that the human freedom of movement is a fundamental part of who we are as humans. And therefore, thinking through how we conceptualize the border. The border, I think, is a really, as we've said here today already, a very charged concept. But we should really also be critical of thinking about how it's not a physical concept, right? Borders transcend physical boundaries. They're not a literal line in the sand. Rather, today, borders are often found sort of everywhere, nowhere at the same time, right? Because of surveillance technologies and ways in which, through electronic mechanisms, people and objects move around the world. So the border is not something that is static, it's not fixed, and it importantly doesn't necessarily have to overlap with conceptualizations of the state. So the whole idea of the nation state being part of a physical territory is something that was introduced at some point in human history, right? This is not something that is a natural or fixed or neutral concept. Another, I think, important piece of this, when I talk about transit migration, I mentioned people moving through Mexico, for example. I think we often take for granted the idea that people implicitly want to go to places like the United States, that the United States is the preferred, or the primary destination for migrants. I think we should be careful in how we position that, because it may or may not be. In many cases it is, and of course it's also linked very closely to the asylum policies that we'll be talking more about, where the US fits in there. Another sort of piece of this related to that is to use caution with terms that are violent or militarized and dehumanizing, right? I think that happens quite a lot when we discuss migration. Everything from acronyms, UAC, or there's a lot of ways, or just terminology around like floods of migration. There's a lot of ways in which we employ linguistic metaphors or tools like acronyms to talk about migrants that can border very easily on militarized or dehumanizing language. And so to sort of avoid that as well as we have our discussions. And of course, the entire fact that migrants themselves have certain vulnerabilities, health-related vulnerabilities, but this also shapes the lives of people and communities connected to them. So they essentially, there's a lot of spillover effect of migrant experience, and in this case, in my research area, it has to do with healthcare access, for example, or with experiences of health and well-being. those experiences spill over into their families and into their communities. And so we see that fear of deportation affects not only individuals, it affects entire communities in the United States, especially in the US-Mexico border region. And so the presence of, of police, of border patrol, often will create sort of spillover effects in many ways that maybe aren't necessarily the first thing we think of. I don't want to say unintended, because I think it is actually quite intended, and we can talk more about that during the Q&A. I want to be conscious of my time. So just to sort of wrap this up, I think sort of my final point of having sort of a critical approach to migration and health, and to think through how this intersects with issues of ethics, is that, as practitioners, as scholars, as researchers, as all of us who are here today, I think it's a really critical principle, a final principle, to seek ways to eliminate health disparities and uplift migrant populations, regardless of of where we're coming from. I think that should be the end goal. And I think in thinking through some of these pieces, everything around terminology, the way that we treat borders and nation states and migration as natural or fixed objects, those are kind of things I wanted to bring to the conversation today. I'm going to wrap it up here, and I look forward to our Q&A a bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was terrific. I love working with anthropologists, and you reaffirmed why I love working with anthropologists. You always learn so many new things. So now, next we will hear from two physicians. First, Marcia Griffin, and then Wes Boyd. So, Marcia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This has already been rich, and I'm thrilled to be on this panel today and join you. Let me share my screen really quickly. Great. So I am a pediatrician on this charged space of the border. And I've lived down here for 40 years. I kind of came and went, but I've been down here for 40 years. And I love the way that, that this space is being talked about and considered, and that it is very nuanced, and that the border, to those who live on the border, didn't used to be a charged space, really. There's always been migration, but it was open, and our families live on both sides, and we were free to come and go. So so I thank you. I'm also work closely with the American Academy of Pediatrics, and we've just started a border strategist team that has representatives from border communities that are pediatricians, actually working with immigrants in those communities to inform the national policies that we are making or discussing throughout every year. So that's kind of my background. The red arrow on this map is where I live and work. It's the most southern border, and it is really telling that because of our proximity to Central America and South America, 60 to 70% of all immigrants come through our area. And it's a lot farther to get to San Diego or Tucson. So we see the most, so you'll see a lot of reaction in Texas because of the numbers that are here. This is a long border. There are actually, I have been for 6 years, was the medical director at the Catholic Charities Humanitarian Respite Center in McAllen, Texas. And we saw thousands and thousands, and still continue to see thousands of families. But if you've seen one respite center, you've really just seen one respite center. These are accepting families who are seeking asylum, and that have been given permission to come into this country to await their asylum hearing. And they have been given documents. So they are actually awaiting their asylum hearing, but they have documents that they present at the airport or at the bus station to prove that they have a right to come through and remain in this country. They're all going to family members all over the United States. So they don't stay with us very long. So that's so they may stay 24 hours in a shelter before they go on to their families. The shelters are really established to provide shelter and comfort and baths and clean clothes and a warm meal before they get on their next journey. They've had a long journey. And I also have to say that they're not asking for help. So there is a need, but they're not asking for this. We are offering it. So I think that is also something we have to be cognizant of when we talk about the immigrants coming over. So as the medical director at the Respite Center, it was pretty obvious early on that most of them, as Jackie has already talked about, they're all healthy and they're well. They just need to get to their families. But some of them are more vulnerable. So we started a consortium a couple of years ago with Stanford, Texas Children's Hospital, my university, and Migrant Clinician Network to start solving some of the problems for the most vulnerable that we were seeing come into our area. And these two were really addressing pregnant mothers that were showing up and children with chronic healthcare needs or serious medical conditions. So despite the fact that they closed the borders because of COVID, our Border Patrol in this area, who I have a relationship with and text frequently on who's coming over and how many, were allowing third trimester pregnant women to come in. And so we had still, despite that it was closed, saw, over almost 700 last year. We took care of, 400 or 500 pregnant mothers, 225 kids, and a lot of those with chronic healthcare needs because the Border Patrol was allowing them in. So in dealing with that and creating these programs, one of the things we saw is that they came to our border. We can provide some triage or a Band-Aid, but what they really need is access to help, as Heidi said, when they get to their destination community. They don't know how our healthcare system works. We don't know how our healthcare system works. So we created this program with case managers to stay in touch with these parents around their children and their own health until they got an appointment. So we actually make them an appointment wherever they're going. So this started at the Humanitarian Care Respite Center in McAllen, but this past year we decided to extend that to other border shelters. So a month ago, I and one of my colleagues, Dale Garcia, went from San Diego back to Texas to interview really the people at these shelters, not to really get in and get a, moving video of an immigrant telling their story, which I think is hard for me to condone many times because there's a power structure in doing that. And we've all heard many thousands of stories of suffering. What I wanted to know was really what we're asking today. How do we respond to the need at the southern border? And so we went in search of the people who are doing it to ask, how do you respond? How is your community responding? And so we started in San Diego. And I was reminded on the way of this point by Warsan Shire that no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And if you have not seen her read it herself, it's worth going on YouTube to see her read this. So today, because we were talking about this charge space, and I wanted to share some of the people, pictures of them that we met along the way, and some of the points that I kept with me. They made me laugh every day, and they certainly made me cry with some of their stories of the immigrants who had passed through. On your far left is a former nun and RN who is volunteering on the border. And she is giving is really who she is. It's the essence of her being. And she had many stories of years and decades of working with immigrants. Tiffany, with the flag behind her, is the wife of a retired fighter pilot instructor. And she responded to the need through her church, and she 365 days of the year welcomes immigrants in on the border in Texas. Linda and Kathy at the bottom, those are two physicians in San Diego who work 80 hours a week, and they love their work and they can't imagine not doing their work. And so they brought their stories of how their community had come together, as Heidi said, in generosity and solidarity. And Earl is in recovery from a history of substance abuse, and he just wants to give back. And that's why he's there. And Eitan on the right is going into law school, and he wants to know immigration from the ground up. And he's been working in immigration, and finally we convinced him to go to law school. He starts this fall. This is Jose. Jose is a nurse practitioner in Laredo, and he is trying to set up a medical clinic as perfect as he can get. And he partners with two guys, Joe Barron, who I don't have a picture of, and Pastor Mike, who is on the right, who actually lives the slogan on his t-shirt. This is Audrey. Audrey is a family nurse practitioner in Tucson, and she gives excellent medical care, but she also gives comfort and compassion and hugs and shares tears from a deep place of service and love. And on the right is Precious Annie, who is a midwife with us down here, who every mother wants, once they're with her, feels they can be safe to unload their burdens of suffering and tell somebody their story. So we have many, many stories of pregnant women who are pregnant because of rape or left because of domestic violence, or their daughter was raped on the way and she was raped in front of her children. So all your work, everyone's on this, is really critical to advocate for these mothers. They had a unanimous wish that they wanted to say, was that we wish that everybody could see what we see. And what we see is human dignity and grace. And that what we're doing is not radical, which people like to say, it's love. And it's coming from an essence of healing that we cannot deny within ourselves. I don't have to restate how Jackie said it so beautifully. It is not illegal to come to the border. They're coming on trains just like they have been for years and risking their lives and limbs. They're coming on vans, and you can see the look on their face. This is not a trip to Disneyland. These are frightened, abused immigrants who just want to get to their family. These are some of the numbers to really put the numbers up there. I wanted you to see how they do go up and down. As Jackie and Heidi were saying, they go up and down every year. Border Patrol counts them from October through September. So in 2021 through May, we've seen 80,000 unaccompanied kids come through, and that is a huge amount. But it also has to say a lot about parents and COVID and being the only way they can get their kids to safety. And so that's one of the factors. These are the families we're seeing. We had 473,000 in 2019. They go all over the country. All over the country can support and absorb really this many people when you know that they're going to every state. This year we've had 190. We'll nowhere reach that 473 this year. I was asked to also talk about some of the conditions that the children, the unaccompanied children and the children and families that we're seeing and what that is, because I know many of you are physicians in the audience. And so we, in telling this, it's difficult for me because every child has a story, and I believe every child deserves the chance to create their own world and to create peace and have a space of peace in which to grow. But they've already been exposed to so much that whatever we can do to alleviate or buffer that trauma for the rest of their journey as we certainly don't want to be heaping on more abuse. Who do we see? Well, we see kids that have hemophilia, diabetes, seizure disorders, congenital heart conditions that were never diagnosed. We see necrotizing hemangiomas, orthopedic injuries, and any gamut of what you could see in your clinic. If you were a pediatrician, you can see coming across the border. And we're targeting and really prioritizing the ones that we feel need to get into subspecialty care as soon as they come. Besides those normal, we also have to connect to care children who have been tortured and either are coming through the border, through our clinic, or that I am helping attorneys in detention centers. This young girl was tortured in South America and left her deformed. She's 6 years old. We actually were able to connect her to care to two champions in Boston, Dr. Fiona Donahar and Dr. Julia Keeler. And they were able to get her into care within a week of her arrival in Boston. This child was tortured in Reynosa and by the gangs, and that leg you could move it back and forth like that. You can see on the right how the bone's not joint at all. And so we were able to get some immediate care at the border and then send them on to Houston for follow-up. I did want to just point out again that it is a charged area, but so is your community. And they're all coming to neighborhoods near you. And so when we consider what's the need on the border, it's what also is the need in your community. So I looked up, American Immigration Council has great statistics, just some statistics on Massachusetts, and here they are. And you can look around and you all know, because you have huge hearts and are working with these folks, that they're entrepreneurs, some of the best in your neighborhoods. They're restaurant workers and landscape workers and domestic workers. They're keeping our kids. They're building our bridges. And you can see all around you, if people will see them contributing to building community. And so that's what we see as well. So I ask, how do we respond to those arriving in our communities? Each of us, each community has to figure that out. Boston has some incredible organizations and Mass General and doctors there that are helping us, that we're connecting with. But I think for me, if you see suffering, it's something I can't turn away from. That the moral imperative is not something I think about, it's just someone suffering. And so I leave you with one of my heroes, Janusz Korczak. And that's his pen name. He was actually a Polish Jewish doctor named Heinrich Goldschmidt. And he was a children's author. And actually some of his books were the basis of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Sorry. And he ran an orphanage in Warsaw for Jewish children. And he himself was Jewish. And many times people were trying to get him out of the country and would offer him a way to get out. And every time he would refuse and say, well, who would take care of the children? And so this happened several times. But when they finally came for the children, he marched with them in front of them, carrying a baby in his arms and holding a toddler's hand, with all the children clothed and dressed up in their finest. And they walked to the trains together and then were never seen again. And so I think as healers, as people who study this, it is impossible to look away. So each of us has a small part we can play for these children and families at home and on the border and advocating nationwide. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks.
Oh, thank you, Marcia. That was an extraordinary place to bring us to. And now we'll turn to Wes Boyd for some more words from Texas.
Hi there. Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I am truly humbled to be on this panel with these people, and that this whole discussion is dedicated to Leah Zalman, who was a colleague of mine for a decade, is quite moving to me. A little bit about my background, because it's relevant, I think, to why I'm here. I am a psychiatrist, and for the last 28 years, until 10 months ago, was at Cambridge Health Alliance, which is a public safety net hospital just outside of Boston. And we treated, or Cambridge Health Alliance treats, immigrants and uninsured and underinsured individuals and people who are on the outside looking in, and often are deprived of a voice. And so 15 years ago, when one of my students, who was with me for the year, in her third year at Harvard Medical School, said, I'd like to start working with asylum seekers. I understand that there is a need to perform evaluations to support their claims for asylum. And I've been doing medical ethics since medical school. I have a PhD, a master's in philosophy, and a PhD in religion. I'd been doing medical ethics forever, and had sort of verged around the edges in human rights work, but had never done anything specifically with respect to asylum seekers, even though I'm sure I had many as patients, believe it or not. So it was 15 years ago, at the urging or motivation of a student, that I got involved in starting to work with asylum seekers, performing psychological evaluations to support their claims for asylum. And the first year, I may have done 2 of those evaluations, and then the next year, maybe it was 4 or 5. And by 2010, I was one of the co-founders of the Asylum Clinic at Cambridge Health Alliance. Later helped start the clinic at Harvard. And it really has become a large part of my professional identity. I've written a lot about it, worked a lot about it. At this point, sat down with and performed evaluations of roughly 150 asylum seekers, and worked very closely with their lawyers, both in written reports and testifying in courts when necessary. Why I ever got pulled into psychiatry in the first place is probably very similar to why I've come to work with asylum seekers, namely, for various reasons I don't need to get into. I felt like I was growing up an outsider who did not really fit in, but I did get born with some brains and a voice, and I felt like, I can work with people who themselves are on the outside and maybe are deprived of a voice for the kind of structural reasons that Heidi has already mentioned. A couple of things. First of all, the fear of immigrants and disparaging remarks about immigrants. This literally in the United States goes back to our colonial era. Ben Franklin himself in the colonial era was hostile to German Americans. And going back to my German class in college, and I wrote a dissertation on Nietzsche. Was war los mit Ben Franklin, for attacking German Americans. But that was just the start of it. It has been, 20 years later, it was Irish Catholics. They were thought to be loyal to the Pope and therefore not the United States. And as everyone on this call no doubt knows, it's just been one group after another, literally over the last 200 plus years. Eastern Europeans, Italians, German, Chinese, Japanese, internment camps in World War II, et cetera. And right now what we see is this, and have for quite a while, this fear and loathing of people coming across our southern border. Other immigrants to some extent, but certainly directed down there, I would say. Some of the stories I've heard from immigrants and asylum seekers coming from Central America or Africa are people who, as we've already heard on this call, literally are fearing for their lives. If you are a son, a boy growing up in El Salvador, Nicaragua, and the gangs come to you at age 10, 11, 12 and say, we want you to run drugs for us. And you consistently say no, not say no once or twice, but consistently say no, you're basically going to be marked for death. If you are a daughter, a young girl in those same countries, and those same gangs come to you and say, we want you to be our girlfriend, quote unquote girlfriend, sex slave, and you consistently say no, you're going to be killed. If you are the parent of one of those children and you're encouraging your child or trying to keep your child safe and do what any parent would do, you also face death. And so you can imagine, given the stories I've heard firsthand, sitting as close to individuals as I am to this camera, hearing these stories firsthand, you can imagine how it pains me to no end to see that these individuals are essentially have become political footballs. And to hear some of the rhetoric that all of us on this call have heard is beyond abhorrent. I'll say it's hard to fathom, and you've also heard this already as well, it's hard to fathom the amount of trauma that people have faced when they're asking for asylum. They faced trauma and death in their home countries, as I just mentioned. As we heard from Heidi and others, the transit through Mexico, if they're coming from Central America, it's different if people are coming from other parts of the world, but the amount of trauma that people suffered in transit on the way to the US southern border through Mexico is astounding. The data that I have seen are that 80% of the women making that journey are sexually assaulted. And those numbers unfortunately jibe with the folks I've seen. And then to compound matters, if they're fortunate enough to cross the border, to have been treated the way they've been treated by US administration. And for those of us who have been doing this work for a long time, we all know things were bad under Obama, actually. They, as everyone knows, got astoundingly horrific under Trump. And now under Biden, as we heard, as Jackie said, a lot of the policies have just simply been continued. And so, time will tell what ultimately happens with Biden administration and some of its priorities. But I'm not terribly hopeful, unfortunately, but I'm willing to maintain some hope. So what about, what is it about immigrants that gets people so scared and so worked up? Immigrants, contrary to the fears and the hype, the data are actually quite clear. Immigrants do not pose a risk, and we heard this already on this call. They do not pose a risk from a public health perspective, as Jackie said. They're far less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans. Incarceration rates are actually quite low compared to native-born Americans for immigrants. The chances of being murdered by an immigrant as opposed to a native-born American are very, very low. Immigrants also do not cause wages to drop. They don't cause unemployment to go up, despite some of the rhetoric that we've heard. And immigrants are twice as likely to start businesses as non-immigrants. And then this gets to, and I want to also point out a lot of the work that Leah Zalman did. I first met Leah in 2010 when she came to Cambridge Health Alliance as a fellow. I was attending the research groups in medicine at that point on a very regular basis. And so I saw her literally from day one. And if you read the tribute that David bore, longtime chief of medicine at Cambridge Health Alliance, if you read the tribute that he wrote that was included as a link to this invitation, it is astoundingly moving, but it's also dramatically spot on. Leah was so understated. I mean, she's like a sleeper cell, brilliant. And I didn't even appreciate the extent of her work. I mean, I knew a lot of the, and I'm going to quote a couple of her, some of her studies right now, and I knew those, but it was only when I wrote in 2016 a letter supporting her promotion to assistant professor at Harvard Medical School, when I wrote that letter that I saw her CV, and I was literally blown away. I was awestruck. And I remember not long after writing that letter, we were at a faculty gathering and at a Mexican restaurant locally in Cambridge, and I sat down and I was like, wow, Leah, holy smokes, completely understated. What a lovely soul of a person. But a couple of the things that she wrote that support the ways in which immigrants make this country a better place. The paper that I co-authored with Leah, we showed that immigrants, the healthcare expenditures for immigrants in this country are 40% less than they are for native-born Americans, refuting the notion that, oh, these people just come here, these immigrants, quote unquote, these people come in here and utilize resources and they're, taking all of our resources away. Well, in fact, healthcare expenditures are less for immigrants. Also, Leah's work, and this was cited nationally, as is the next one I'm going to say as well, immigrants actually prop up Medicare. They kick more money into Medicare than they ever take out. They do the same thing for private insurance pools here in the United States. Why is that? As we already heard, immigrants tend to be healthier and younger. And often, as we also heard, I think from Heidi, migration goes back and forth. Lots of people are moving into the United States and then at some point going back to their home countries, and it's a fluid process. So often immigrants are kicking money into insurance pools before they even are able, for example, to utilize Medicare later in life. So from a utilitarian perspective, this is an ethics discussion after all. From a utilitarian perspective, we ought to be doing everything we can to bring immigrants into this country. The data are overwhelmingly clear that they make this country a better place. And I'll tell you, it was a few years ago, I was writing a featured invited piece for the inaugural edition of the HMS Harvard Medical School Bioethics Journal. And the title of my piece was something to the effect of "The Case for Keeping Our Borders Open." And I actually said what I just said to you about utilitarian, let's bring people in. I said, from a radical this is my draft. From a radical utilitarian perspective, we actually ought to be deporting native-born Americans, given what the data show. And guess what? The editors of the new journal took that out, and it never got into print by me. However, about 3 months later, there was a New York Times op-ed by Bret Stephens saying, ironically, of course, let the mass deportations begin. And what he was saying was exactly the point I was making. I mean, both of us, tongue in cheek, but the data are still nonetheless quite clear. So I'll just have much more to say, but for the purposes of time, and this is a medical ethics discussion, this is what I'm about to say is the test prep portion of my remarks. There are four, as probably everybody on this call knows, there are four basic principles in medical ethics: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. We can debate whether there should be those four principles or what the other considerations ought to be, but for the purposes of this discussion, considerations of migration and immigration and asylum, people in their home countries, when they are fleeing for their lives, and the people I've seen who want asylum here in the United States, they're not coming to have a better life. They're coming to save their lives. It's life or death. They're deprived of their autonomy. Promoting good, if you want to promote good and prevent harm, non-maleficence, then let them come in, because any country as wealthy as ours, with the resources that we have, as you just saw in the last presentation, it is so dramatically easy to absorb those individuals into our country who are trying to save their lives. We have the resources. The question is, do we make it a national priority to actually put money where it needs to be? And then how does consideration of medical ethics factor into human rights concerns? I would say the final medical ethical principle that I didn't mention is justice. And any consideration of justice has to go right down to fundamental human rights. And so it's not surprising that every international document including the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, says that one has the fundamental human right to seek asylum in other countries. I don't see how, as a moral nation, if we even want to try to call ourselves that supposedly, that was my timer, that supposedly wants to do right by individuals, I don't know how we don't keep our borders open. And I'll finally say this. You know, some people have said, well, as a physician, ought you be working in the human rights arena? Why not confine yourself to how you were trained? You were trained as a physician to treat individual human beings. In a certain sense, that's correct. However, everybody on this call knows that, and we've heard it from Heidi and everybody else, that social conditions absolutely affect health and well-being. And if we are in the medical field, if we are caregivers, we have no choice but to look at all of the factors influencing the health and well-being of our clients and patients, not just attending to an individual's body. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you again for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Wes. That was absolutely wonderful. And I'm so glad that you were able to talk more about Leah and about her tremendous, tremendous legacy. And it must be wonderful to have been part of it. So what I'm going to do now is I've been feverishly taking notes because my task here is to suggest something that we do a lot in ethics, which is we talk about frameworks. Literally, how do you build something? How do you construct an idea of the right thing to do, rather than just saying, well, this is my strong intuition. The psychologists have taught us that we get to our intuitions, our strong feelings about right or wrong, a lot faster than we get to our reasons. But if we're talking about policy changes, and we tend to be talking about large-scale social changes here, we have to be able to convince other people about the course of action we should take. We have to think about collective action. We're talking about investments and so on and so forth. So I'm going to offer some ideas that come from thinking about this. My initial work in immigrant health over the past 10 years has started with the questions of doctors saying, I have this undocumented patient. I have another patient. They're both poor, but the undocumented one, I cannot get it on Medicaid. So I'm already practicing two different standards of medicine and I don't like that feeling. So they're distressed about the experience and people bring that distress and uncertainty to the table. So I and a colleague created a project called the Undocumented Patients Project to explore some of these questions. But we realized these weren't only questions about undocumented patients in hospitals. These also happened in clinics. They happened at the border. They happened further upstream for people whose lives were being disrupted enough by climate change, by violence, by other instability to realize that they were going to have to consider leaving. So our work, even though we may be focused on one place when we think about this issue, we may be in Boston and Cambridge, we may be at the border, we may be doing work in Geneva, trying to figure out how to work on issues globally, where they're not all exactly the same ethical framework. So I'm going to make a few suggestions. And I think coming out of a pandemic experience of suddenly having to think at a very large scale will be helpful here. So here's a few thoughts. So first, and I want to mention that I think of these as my lessons from Leah. After she died, I wrote a little blog post about things I learned from her. Leah was a researcher, and one of the things because she was so modest, as Wes pointed out, and she would call these incredible studies that she'd done about the cost of care or immigrants' contributions to the Social Security system or the Medicare system. She would call them her duh studies, like duh. Of course they contribute. Duh, of course primary care costs less than emergency care. But she knew it was really important to do those meticulous studies because you weren't going to change policy without that data. That was very important. So it's one of her greatest legacies is having done those studies and shared them nationally and internationally. So I think one lesson from Leah here is, as we're thinking about an ethical framework, is what do you need to know? What facts do you have to have in hand as a starting place for mapping an ethical course of action? Not just slogans. We may start with a strong intuition about healthcare as a human rights or migrant justice now or whatever it may be. But we have to get a little more concrete than that. So one thing is to be very clear on your facts and to be very clear on questions of law, because as Jacqueline will be able to point out, there are appeals to human rights and there are specific points of international human rights law concerning protections and obligations to migrants that are important to keep in mind if that's the context you're working in. Another aside from Leah is when she would give talks on this topic, she'd say, you have to be careful with the phrase human rights because you could lose half your audience right away. Because some people will say, oh, I know what you're about to say. Open those borders, or no, this isn't Sweden. No, we're not going to be and they just shut down. So you just have to be careful to be able to read your audience and say, no, what points am I trying to get across here? So that was another very sharp point of hers. So in this issue of framing, and that's a framing question right there. How do you frame your case? I think the duty to plan is very important. It's the bedrock duty of public health. We're talking about public health. We're talking about global health, population health. It's the first thing you write when you're talking about pandemic ethics, the duty to plan. You can't wait for a pandemic to arrive in your city and then say, I think we better get organized. And as Jackie pointed out, politicians deliberately pretend that migration isn't something that they can see coming. It's always a crisis, and calling something a crisis or a state of emergency, those sorts of things are distractions to us. They kind of frighten us, they stress us, and we forget to think clearly and say, wait, this has been going on a long time. There are predictable reasons, push factors, as migration studies experts would say, that push people from one place and pull them toward another. And so we can learn those things and we can teach those things so we don't freak out every time somebody calls something a crisis, and being very alert to the stigmatizing language, the hordes. These are terms that go way, way back in history. If you want to dehumanize a group, you refer to them as something non-human. You refer to them as waves, as something that's going to be a natural disaster, and you delegitimize them. You say, well, this tsunami of migrants is going to flood us, meaning we're going to be drowned by them. And you forget, and you realize that, these are people and we're people. And, so we have to recognize, when someone is trying to manipulate a conversation. We need to remember that we are often talking about global and national contexts, but ultimately, we're always talking about a local context. Where do we care for people where they are? How do we care for people along a journey? And how do we care for them where they're going? Because migrants want to go somewhere. There were several references to Boston and to other different places. There's a terrific map from the Pew Research Center, which is a great research database on migration. And they have this great map of the United States, and it shows 20 cities. So I just call it the 20 cities map, that shows where most undocumented immigrants and other low-wage migrants settle. So it's 20. Boston is on the map. My city, New York, is on the map. I'm sure Houston is on the map. And that really helps you focus. You don't have to solve every problem for everywhere. If you can make things better in one of those metropolitan areas, you've done something on behalf of a very large part of the migrant population in the United States. So that's a good thing to know, that you may not be able to solve the border as a state of mind, as a place, because we're not where Marcia is, but we can do something where we are, especially if we're in a major metropolitan area, or perhaps we're in a rural area and we are working on farm worker health. So that's another possibility. So in addition to the duty to plan, we can, as I mentioned, learn the specific protections and duties owed to migrants. It's always good to get to know human rights lawyers, and it's also very good to get to know medical legal partnerships. They're all over the country. They are experts in helping patients with health-related social needs that include immigration. And in Boston is very well coordinated in terms of the medical, legal, social service infrastructure for migrants. So that's very helpful. You don't have to know it all yourself, but you do need to know when you're beyond your own area of expertise, and reaching out to your colleagues who know the law is very, very helpful. I think another concept that's very important is precarity. The fact that migration always has some economic component, even if people are leaving a place for political reasons and are seeking political assignment, they also want to get a job. They're going to need to pay the rent. They're going to need to provide for a family in many cases. And a migrant is always in a precarious economic and social situation because of the fact that they have to maybe consider that they may need to leave because their conditions are becoming intolerable with maintaining life along the journey, which is very, very dangerous. And once they are in their destination country or their transit country. So to remember to account for the migrant when you are thinking about social justice in a place is very important. For the past year, we've been talking a lot about health equity. We've been talking about populations that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. Migrants are one of those populations. When you think about the data on the transmissibility of this virus in overcrowded housing, in overcrowded workplaces, who works in slaughterhouses, who is doubled up in housing? This is our population. So we don't always have to be working in migration studies or migrant health to be thinking about migrant health. So I think in addition to thinking about medical ethics, which were designed for clinical settings, population health, health equity, the work of the great Nancy Krieger at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health on social epidemiology is a really good lens for thinking about these issues. Another thing that's important are the points Heidi mentioned, is that we should avoid fixed categories of migrant versus citizen. Sometimes I think in terms of social citizens, people who may not have the rights of political citizens, may not be able to vote, for example, but are members of the society, are contributing to the society in which they live, and often to a society that people may think of as their home society. Political philosophers like Joseph Cairns have suggested that it takes about 7 years for a migrant to settle, often by having children. And so we've seen with the DACA population, the dreamer population, that it really appeals to people's moral intuitions when you talk about the wrongness of uprooting a child from their society, even if it's not the society in which they hold a passport and they are not able to get a passport, but it's the only home they've ever known. So it's helpful to be thinking about that idea of the process by which one becomes settled. It's also interesting if you talk with colleagues who work on indigenous issues throughout the world, there's been a very interesting rhetorical shift in talking about natives versus settlers. The settlers are the incomers, often white colonizers, who are always going to be seen as the new people, the disruptors. And so it really flips the script when we talk about us and them in terms of migrants versus the legitimate people. And we realize that in another discourse, we're the settlers. So that can be very interesting. And also in indigenous studies, there's often a history of forced migration, of displacement, of being thrown off of one's own land or out of one's country. So I always find those to be interesting conversations to be in touch with. So none of that is going to tell us exactly how to solve a problem like migration, but I think we understand right now that this isn't a solvable problem. It's what's sometimes called a wicked problem. It changes so much that you can't get a fix on it and solve it definitively, but there are better and worse ways to manage wicked problems. So I think some of the issues that have been raised up are the idea of working with a duty of care which is Jacqueline has written about, which Wes alluded to in talking about medical ethics. Alexander Betts, who's a migration studies scholar, has talked about a duty of rescue. So these are things that are discernible in medical ethics that can be applied more broadly to vulnerable populations. When we talk about vulnerable populations, we're used to thinking of children as vulnerable populations. Many migrants are children. Many migrants are of childbearing age. So there's always special duties to children. So that's another helpful framework to remember how populations intersect. And let's see, a few other points here. Another point I wanted to make about, we've talked about the issue of open borders, and there, Joseph Cairns, who I mentioned earlier, has done a lot of interesting work in the Boston Review on the case for open borders and sort of saying, you know, would that solve our problems? And I tend to agree with the great journalist of migration, Sonia Nazario, that it's not the solution. Because for one thing, who would be left behind if you opened the borders? Not everyone's mobile. Older, disabled people and the very poorest people in a society would probably not be able to migrate. They would not be healthy enough to migrate or have enough money to migrate. I also study aging, and I'm very conscious of the fact that migrants are usually younger. At times when family reunification has been deliberately politically disrupted, we could not bank on the fact that younger people would be able to go ahead, establish a family, establish an income, and then bring other family members. So we have to be a little careful about the idea that opening borders would solve problems, because a border might be hundreds or thousands of miles away from where you were trying to get to. But it's important to think about that. Not every border in the world is the US-Mexico border, but that was just one issue there. And finally, another point that I learned about from Leah, who took a part in a public health symposium that my organization, the Hastings Center, held 3 years ago, was at the height of the family separation. And it was pretty clear that lawyers had gotten organized because they could go and establish client relationships with people in detention. Journalists had gotten organized and were reporting from the border. And I was wondering, well, what could doctors do? What could healthcare professionals do? There were certainly people who worked with Physicians for Human Rights and did evaluations for asylum seekers and helped in many, many different ways. But I was interested into what a typical health system could do. And I was interested in the idea of systems of safety. And so we began to talk about this with a group of doctors like Leah from throughout the country, immigrant health doctors, with lawyers, and with immigrant health grassroots activists. And I always remember a gesture that Leah made. She went like this, and she said, I know when I get together with my colleagues to try to advocate on behalf of a patient, I have this much space, this much more of myself, in addition to everything else I'm doing to advocate for that person. It's not sufficient. I can't advocate for everybody. I can't use up every bit of political clout I have on behalf of each person. We need to do this in a system-oriented way. And later in the meeting, she said, we need a learning collaborative. We need to put immigrant health on the same basis as we put other healthcare problems. We need to make this something that we want to be excellent at. We need to tell our institutions that we need the resources to do this. So this isn't a problem or a charity case or a special case or something that we try to solve in secret, by, giving somebody an extra, some extra food here and a blanket there or whatever it may be, but something that our institution is proud of, that we're doing really well on this issue. This is what we were working on right before the pandemic. We were thinking about how to create these models for people in different health systems who work on immigrant health to come together and to create platforms for change in healthcare systems. And so even though Leah isn't here anymore, this is something I always try to talk about, to say there are people like her. There are people like her in your system. If you could just get together sometime. Sometimes I'll go to a health system and people will think there's only 5 people like them, and then 40 people will show up at a meeting. And you can begin to create the beginning of a community of people who care about immigrant health in the place where you are, and be networked with people at the border and elsewhere in the world. So it strengthens you. So those are just some remarks on an ethical framework, and I'm always happy to talk further about this issue, but I'm going to turn now to some curated questions that each of our panelists have asked me to ask them. So let me just pull up my notes here. So the first question is, first 2 questions are for Jacqueline. How are Central American migrants to the US protected by international law? And what should the US do to better adhere to its legal obligations under that law? Jacqueline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Bellinger, very much. And thank you for those wonderful comments that you just made, which I thought was so rich and far-ranging. So I think that, first of all, as we've already said, and I think we've all agreed, the US needs to take international law seriously. And those of us who are international lawyers often say that the US is an outlier because there's so many aspects of international law where the US is not in adherence, unlike, for example, members of the European Union or other kind of fellow wealthy nations, Canada, Australia, and so on. Fortunately, refugee law, international refugee law, is an area of international law where the US is a party. The US has not absented itself from refugee law. And so it needs to take its obligations, I think, more seriously. And that means, as I tried to say earlier, that the US needs to make resources available so that people who are fleeing asylum, fleeing persecution, who need asylum, can have timely access to a decision, can have respectful, dignified, safe places in which to wait, not dangerous places, not unhealthy places where they may face other risks and so on. So I think that's the kind of baseline. And I think for children in particular, as some of the other panelists have mentioned, there's an additional obligation that any government has, which is to provide safety and protection where children are unprotected by their parents if they're traveling alone, or they're separated from their parents, they're in the custody, say, of neighbors or elder siblings. Then any government that is has the custody of those children formally has an obligation, additional obligation, to provide protection and safety. And there again, I think the US has really fallen short, despite, you know, the numbers of extraordinarily dedicated professionals and individuals who are involved in providing care. We've heard from a couple of them today. But as a polity, as a country, I think the US has really fallen short. I think all of us probably listening to this discussion remember with considerable horror the family separation policy that occurred under the previous administration. That was really a particularly low point. But unfortunately, that's part of a continuum of pretty low points in the treatment of children who are traveling alone. When I first came to the US over 20 years ago, I was and went and visited some of the detention facilities and interviewed some of the people working with unaccompanied children. I was shocked to see children not charged with any criminal offense, handcuffed, see them in really harsh facilities with people who were really prison guards. This is kind of unacceptable. And I think an ethical government needs to really seriously rethink the way in which unaccompanied children are treated and really change the landscape. Unfortunately, unlike the Refugee Convention, the other major relevant international convention applying to children, the International Convention on the Rights of the Child, has not been ratified by the United States. In other words, the United States is not bound by the terms of that convention. And that is why I think some of the excesses that we see have been allowed. But I think that whether or not the US ratifies the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I think it's unlikely, to be honest, for a host of reasons we could discuss. Nevertheless, I think that political pressure could be exerted to at least ensure that children who are unaccompanied are treated, ethically, respectfully, and with the care and attention and speed that they need. And we've really been lacking in that respect. So those are the points I would make about what the US needs to do in terms of the law. I would say one other thing, if I may, just picking up on some of the points made earlier about terminology, which I think is so important. It is so easy to demonize people as being illegals or as being cheats, or to use other kind of generic terms to kind of create a them and us situation. But it's also very true that to open up a conversation with people who may have different views from one's own, one needs to establish some sort of common ground. And I just wanted to relate this anecdote. I was talking to an excellent New York Times journalist some time ago who's written extensively on immigration matters. And I noticed whenever she discussed issues to do with undocumented migrants, she always used to refer to them as illegal immigrants. And I said to her, why do you use this terminology, illegal? In my opinion, nobody is illegal. Somebody may not be in conformity with the law, but it doesn't make a person an illegal person. And she said, I can see why you're saying that, but I'm trying to actually address people who use that terminology. And I know that if I use words like undocumented migrant, that'll immediately kind of, raise a red flag, and they'll say, oh, this is some progressive journalist, and they won't even listen to what I say. So it's an interesting tension, I think, that we face. On the one hand, trying to use terminology in a way which isn't othering or demonizing, but on the other hand, also trying to bridge some of these big political divides to bring people along and try to influence people's opinions. So those perhaps are the comments I would offer at this point.
Thank you, Jackie. And now, again, to a point, one of the points I mentioned was the importance of having our facts and our context. Heidi's questions, which she's going to answer helpfully, are: where do current events at the borders fit in with other historical migration patterns? How is this border crisis similar to or different from ones that we've seen before? And in coming years, should we expect migration to continue at the same levels or less or more?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you. I think some of the things that have been said here today are already pretty telling. First of all, I really appreciated Marcia's comment that at the border, families have lived on both sides of the border for a very long time, and oftentimes it's the border that changes and not people's movement patterns, right? So I think there's something to be said for historicizing this and thinking about at what point do we consider it to be abnormal or pathological that people are moving when we've always been moving as humans? We were also talking earlier, Jackie was saying that, migration is entirely predictable, right? For us to act as if this were a state of emergency, this were something unusual, this were something, unexpected, is naive, and it's certainly in many ways a bit of a political game. Certainly, can we expect migration patterns to continue to increase? Absolutely, for a variety of reasons, not just sort of the economic and political pressures, but also the environmental pressures associated with climate change are pushing people out in greater numbers than ever before, and creating new types of refugees that we have seen, right? It's a matter of, as we say, old wine in new bottles. It's in many ways, we should look at this as continuing patterns that have been going on throughout human history, but most especially over the past 100 years or so. I do think we should expect more migration. I think there are these push and pull factors that will continue, and they shift. They look quite different over time, but they continue. And I think it's more about the response, right? If this is anticipated, why are we not prepared for it? And I think that's the real question here. you know, what's unique about the current situation, I think, in some ways it is a matter of scale and scope of migration has increased over the past 2 or 3 decades, certainly. But I do think that I think we have to be cautious in making the current situation or the future situation to appear to be unique in any way. I think we have to see it historically. I think you're on mute.
Thanks, Heidi. In view of the shortness of time, I'm going to ask Marcia and Wes these questions jointly and kind of combine your questions, and also because you're both doctors and you're both based in Texas, so you're closer to the U.S.-Mexico border than many of the rest of us. As seen from your perspective,
David?
Oh, sorry. As seen from your perspective on the border, right, in your case, right on the border, Marcia, what is the threat to the United States? The idea of the existential threat we see this versus, you know, is this a threat or is it not, in terms of what could happen to the United States given the current and projected flow of migration. And Wes, what do you think can be done to generate compassion for immigrants and asylum seekers, given the barrage of, you know, really toxic rhetoric and news coverage about them, certainly during the previous administration, but also, as has been mentioned, it can very quickly turn in a given place if a particular region feels like there's suddenly too much, too many, whatever it may be. So, you know, just wonder, two perspectives from Texas on these questions.
Okay, I'll go first. I'll quickly, so Wes, because I'm dying to hear you what you think we can do to stop this. To me, the existential threat that people perceive is like, oh my God, where our country is going to become a completely Spanish-speaking country, and oh, wring our hands, and we'll not be a white majority all the time, and oh my God, this is horrible. That's not the existential threat. We have had migration forever. The existential threat is to not care for them, is to harden, to allow the hatred to harden our hearts, and to have discussions about, well, what should we do and what ought we do, instead of planning and responding. Because I can tell you, one of the things is to not accept the abuse by the US government on children and families. Quickly, I told a story in Canada, in Toronto, once for the Society of Refugee and Immigrant Health. And I was on a panel with my Canadian colleagues who were physicians. And I just spoke very briefly about walking into the processing center of the Border Patrol. I have a relationship with the Border Patrol, but we also are often adversarial. And to walk in there with the presidents of the AAP, and them to see the children in cages, which I'd seen many times before, but to see 700 kids on the floor on mats under Mylar blankets, and 700 kids completely quiet. All you could hear was the rustling of the Mylar blankets and piles of clothes and teddy bears. And it was shocking. And that we knew that it's not normal for 700 kids to be quiet at any time. And they weren't asleep. They were petrified. And so they kept completely quiet. And the Canadians said, oh my God, if we saw a mother and a baby, or we saw these kids, the Canadian Mounted Patrol would be coming across to push the pram. We would have picked up these children. Why is that not our visceral response? And then just briefly about what can the doctors do if they're organized? The doctors, with our attorney colleagues, turned around separation, because the organized medicine responded with 13, including the AMA and AAP and ACOG, 13 organized medical societies wrote letters to protest the separation. And I was lucky to do some letters of declaration with the ACLU about the separation. And I was on a panel later, and somebody asked Lee Gillern, who led it, what changed it? What pushed it? And he was like, well, there was a lot of lawyers fighting, but what it was the doctors got organized and stood up and protested this horrible thing. So I think we can see instances where organized is doing something, and it just gets frustrating because we want to do some more and we're impatient in our own systems. Okay, Wes.
Very moving, Marcia, actually. Thank you. I'll answer the question first that I asked, which I still find I asked myself, which I still find a very difficult question. But before I go there, just going back to what you said, Nancy, about what Leah said, that human rights is a word that very easily can turn people off. And Jackie said the same thing about talking about undocumented people or migrant people. I completely agree that those terms in certain settings will stop an audience from listening dead in their tracks and lose them entirely. And so to get to what I think, if there is any hope other than the kind of data that Leah generated in so many of her studies, which I think more would work in political circles and arenas than it might in individual hearts, because I think the data are very clear about the beneficial effects of immigrants and asylum seekers and so on here in this country. I think if there's any hope for moving people's hearts and getting them to care and listen, it's going to be individual stories. I'll give you one example, a story of a woman I saw from Eastern Europe who was one of the most incredible asylum seekers I've ever seen. I won't get into I know we're short on time, but literally like jaw-dropping pain and resilience in her story. And I went from seeing her back to my house. My mother lived with us for 23 years. She's dying of cancer. So all my siblings are coming through, including my far right-wing sister, who was a Trump supporter and listened to Rush Limbaugh and Fox News and all that. Of course, now it's gone to Newsmax. And she said, so what were you doing? And I told her the story in bullet form. And I said, and this is the kind of person whose asylum your people oppose. And she said, no, not people like her, right? Not a story like that. It's the other people, right? And so I do think that if there is any hope in getting through on a human level, which may translate into policy, it's going to be stories, in addition to the kind of data that people like Leah and others have generated.
I agree.
Thank you both. I've responded to a few informational questions in the chat. Thank you so much. And I think some people are from the Boston or Cape Cod area and are looking for ways that they can get involved via they may be medical professionals. So one resource that I've suggested is the Physicians for Human Rights Asylum Network, where people can be trained to do evaluations, psychological and medical evaluations, and be part of a network of a community of practitioners. I've also suggested that getting in touch with, if you live in the United States, if you can identify an immigrant advocacy organization. I think Marcia has mentioned working with Catholic Charities. That's often an organization that is involved. Federally qualified health centers or community health centers often have migrant health programs. That's a good place to plug in. One person wrote in and is a retired ESL teacher. Well, depending on the migrant population where she lives, that could be a tremendous skill to have. So there's always something you can do. There are innovative projects, grassroots projects all over the country. but they're probably going to be in a church. They're probably going to be in a church basement. There's a project not far from me here in Washington Heights in New York City. And the woman who runs it, it's a project for expectant women and mothers and little children up until they can go to free preschool in New York City, which starts at age 3. And the goal was to get the children ready for school from birth onward. And by the time they're in kindergarten, to help the mother learn how to advocate for her child in English. So that's the whole goal is figuring all of this out. I mean, it's a course at a church because these mothers are very scared and they feel safe here. So you have to remember there won't be a big sign, telling you where to go. You're going to have to, talk with different people, medical professionals, maybe lawyers who are involved in human rights. And there's a really good network coordinated in Boston by Dr. Lara Germanis, who was Leah Zalman's clinical colleague. I can't quite remember what the acronym is, but it's lawyers and doctors working together, and there's a listserv and things like that. But I should turn it over now to our host, to AK, who will see us out.
Hi. It's a tough act to follow. I just want to thank everyone for amazing, amazing contributions. I'm sort of struck. I think the thing that I struggle with is the sense that we all think we're good people, right? Everybody, whatever your political affiliation is, and people have things they're passionate about. And I'm struck, I think the lessons learned when I think about the last year is how we can be manipulated and how we can be charged by language, by issues that trigger us. And one of the things that I think has been covered so well about this particular very important issue is how governments, which ultimately is us, because we elect them, and society in general can do great good and do great harm. And we have to navigate thoughtfully how to do the best we can do. The final thing I think about is for everybody who bears witness to suffering, there is a personal cost, a personal moral distress. For instance, what Marcia was talking about, the terrible, terrible distress of thinking about the suffering of children. And so how we can frame in non-triggering language education and advocacy to help. There are going to be many other questions. In many ways, we all want this to be a continuation of dialogue together. And you can email our website, you can email us and continue the dialogue. So I wanted to thank you all for taking your evening hours to join us, although it occurs to me that Heidi it's probably like midnight or something where you are. So thank you for staying awake and contributing. So just wanted to say goodbye to you all for now. Thank you.